Good morning, AWS, and welcome to the second episode of AWS Morning Brief, gathering the news from AWS, contextualizing it through a lens of why it matters to the market, and then I make fun of it. I'm your host, cloud economist Corey Quinn. This show focuses on a longer list of AWS releases than generally makes the last week in AWS newsletter, and then it lets me go off script way more. So strap in. But first, this episode is sponsored by AWS themselves, specifically their upcoming Reinforce conference. For those who did not catch it last week, this remains the premier and only cloud security conference named after an email subject line, and it's coming to Boston on June 25th and 26th. In a truly horrifying turn of events, I'm giving half of a track keynote, something that only now is dawning on AWS marketing. What might I say? What might I do? Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, what might my slides have written on them? If you care about cloud security, which you don't, because nobody does until it's way too late, but maybe you could be the change you want to see in the world. Come to Boston. Their street map even looks like a microservices diagram. It is perfectly aligned for this. There are tracks for every skill level. There's a security jam, a capture the flag event, and later in this show, I'll give you a discount code that knocks some money off of registration. I'm going to be there. You should be there too. Now, what happened last week in AWS? They launched AWS Systems Manager OpsCenter to enable faster issue resolution, which is super good news from my perspective because it's great to see that Tom Clancy continues to write books from beyond the grave. Systems Manager OpsCenter is the latest in the ongoing series written by computer. We're going to keep going with that. It turns out that AWS Organizations now supports tagging and untagging of AWS accounts. Well, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean all the resources inside of that account? Just the free account bits? Just the account itself? Once again, the details of this release are left to the reader to discover. It's a magical journey into the future, except it's terrible. Amazon ECS improves ENI density for AWS VPC networking mode. If you're still awake after that title, pay attention. This is huge for folks who are trying to pack additional containers into ECS. Historically, this was causing limit issues, latency concerns, and all kinds of other unfortunate failure modes. But instead of leading with that, instead they talk about this like it's some kind of deep, arcane, trivial enhancement. Great feature enhancement, lousy storytelling, that's an AWS release. Amazon EC2 instances, specifically the Z1D family, are now available in the UK London region. First, my apologies. That's the London region, so we're going to call it Z1D out of deference. Also, they call it the UK (London) region. That used to be called EU West 1, now it's the UK region. Sneaky with the European politics. Good work, AWS. Speaking of politics, Amazon's KMS service is now available in the AWS China Beijing region, operated by Sinet, and the AWS China, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, Ningxia? My apologies for butchering the name of a place where people live, region, which is operated by NWCD. They've also announced EBS encryption there as well. Now, one of two things is happening, and either one is dramatic, and I don't know which it is. Anytime you deal with encryption in mainland China, you have to give the government the encryption keys. Either they have an exemption for this now, which is incredible and world-shaking, or in this particular regions, they need to give a copy of the master key over to the Chinese government, in which case there needs to be a giant screaming asterisk next to the fact that this is not the KMS or EBS encryption guarantees that we all know and love. The fact that they don't go into any detail on that makes me wonder which it is, and continues to force me to regard the mainland China region with suspicion and distrust. The AWS well-architected tool now supports 8 times more text in the notes field, and the AWS system also supports 8 times more tools in the customer field as well. I kid, mostly. There was a blog post on how to securely provide database credentials to Lambda functions using Secrets Manager, which is great. You can tune in next week for the database blog posting a follow-up article on how to quickly scale up your database clusters when all those Lambda functions reduce those clusters to smoking craters. It turns out that most databases don't like 10,000 Lambda functions all trying to talk to them at the same time. Amazon EC2 announces host recovery, which sounds super exciting. What it does is it automatically recovers failed instances and restarts them for you if you tell it to, but doesn't actually matter because it talks about dedicated hosts instead. The fact that people are still using dedicated hosts is a bit of a misunderstanding, specifically on the grounds of you probably don't need to use them. Once upon a time, if you were managing HIPAA-regulated data, you absolutely needed to go ahead and have dedicated hosts, or Amazon wouldn't sign the BAA you needed, and any liability on anything fell squarely to you. That's no longer the case, which means if you're running dedicated hosts, you either have very strange requirements that I don't generally see, or you're still in that pattern because you weren't aware that that had changed. Or you just don't know that they're running in your environment. Turn them off. You'll save a lot of money by doing that one thing alone. 2 weeks ago, I missed this one, where they've launched variable budget targets for cost and usage budgets. This came out of the AWS Cost Management blog, and this release should be sponsored by Advil, because you can enjoy the pounding headache as you start to imagine a large enterprise's variable budget model for on-demand cloud spend for an 18-month planning cycle, and what this release probably says about those processes. Some months it's up, some months it's down. It generally trends up, but you have to predict all of that. But this podcast was not sponsored by Advil. This podcast has been sponsored by AWS, specifically the upcoming Reinforce conference. At the beginning of this show, I mentioned I'd be giving you a discount code, and I'm a man of my word, so here it is. That's RFSAL19. That's Romeo Foxtrot Sierra Alpha Lima 19er. And why should you use that code? First, it gives you money off. That's awesome. Secondly, because you should be going to the conference, as mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, because security is invariably an afterthought until it's too late. There are talks for users of virtually any different path. Business execs, InfoSec types, various specialty folks. Even if all you want to do is wander the expo hall and collect all of the swag, by all means, consider it a game of Pokemon. Have fun. There are going to be hundreds of sessions from leading experts in this field, and also me. Again, that code is RFSAL19. If you use that code, please ping me and let me know that you're going to be there. I have plans around this conference, and I'd love to catch up with you folks. Back to the list of releases. They have released X1 and X1E instances in additional AWS regions. Those are the things with terabytes of RAM shoved into them. So you can now spend extortionate piles of money in additional faraway places. In fact, in some of those places, these instances could possibly be the most expensive thing in the entire country. Amazon's Elastic File System, or EFS, has become available in the Mumbai region, which is great, because if you're running things in Mumbai, you now can use the best implementation of one of the worst architectures ever created, NFS. I understand why you may have to do it. I still maintain you probably shouldn't. Amazon Pinpoint now includes support for AWS CloudFormation. Okay, Pinpoint launched on December 1st of 2016. I don't understand why this is just casually mentioned as a release. That's not a release. It was 2.5 years ago, and now it supports CloudFormation. I don't expect an announcement. I expect an apology. Your service isn't done until it supports CloudFormation and tagging. And I'm finished making fun of it. ECS support for Windows Server 2019 containers is now generally available, which is awesome because you can now run Windows containers on top of ECS, and I don't know how that sentence is supposed to end. Are people running Windows workloads in containers at any point of scale today? Is this a thing that I've somehow missed? Am I the idiot? Have I missed an entire revolution that somehow has passed me by? Is this just something to check a box somewhere? Is this microphone even on? Amazon's DocumentDB, with MongoDB compatibility, yes, that is the formal service name, is now available in the Sydney region. Terrific. Amazon is saying that now MongoDB can go screw itself down under it as well. Amazon i3EN instances are now available in additional AWS regions. Which regions? We don't know. They didn't bother to put that in the headline because at this point, whoever has to write these release announcements is pretty much just going ahead and phoning regional expansions in. Good. Stop announcing them other than directly to people doing things in that region or who have expressed an interest. Most of us don't care. You're just filling their feeds with noise. AWS Glue now provides a VPC interface endpoint, which is awesome and amusing because it's supporting a service called Glue, but somehow it feels like instead it's been slapped together with duct tape. Yay, it now supports VPC endpoints, almost like it should have since launch. Either support a thing or don't support a thing, but make your mind up. Amazon Inspector has done a couple of interesting things. First, it adds CIS benchmark support for Amazon Linux 2. For those who aren't familiar with the CIS benchmarks, it gives a list of things you should do and then validate that you've done to properly secure a wide variety of things. Most commonly, you'll see this in the context of operating systems. Now they support telling you to do things like don't set a root password, instead use keys and sudo into it, or things of that nature now for the second version of Amazon Linux. It also is available in the Europe, London region. Well, wait a minute. They called it the UK region a couple of releases ago. Now they're calling it Europe region. Ooh. So that means there are factions inside of AWS who are taking this politically very differently. I would love to get the future story about this in a tell-all book some year. AWS Data Sync is now SOC compliant. So if you wash your socks in the data sync, it turns out that you might get yelled at by other adults in the house, no matter how much you protest that it's a work requirement. Amazon Elasticache for Redis has launched self-service updates, and only in the world of modern cloud does we're going to let you do something yourself become a feature rather than something to be eliminated. Amazon Elasticsearch service announces support for Elasticsearch 6.7. So between the open distro for Elasticsearch political angle, the managed Elasticsearch service is not terrific angle, the is this managed service still tracking upstream Elasticsearch or their own fork of it angle, and the why do minor version bumps get trumpeted angle, I have now successfully built a very strange looking quadrilateral. You're welcome, geometry teachers. That joke was for you. Lastly, the AWS Security blog has a profile of Matthew Campagna, Senior Principal Security Engineer in Cryptography, which I generally tend to mean his first language is, of course, math. But he's been with AWS for almost 6 years. Apparently, he joined as a principal security engineer and then got a little bit deeper into cryptography. At the beginning, he was apparently involved with designing KMS, and since then, he's been involved in a bunch of other projects he, of course, can't tell us about because security, but now works as something called the AWS Cryptography Bar Raisers Group, because of course it's called that. Snark aside, it tends to focus on building out interesting and novel applications of cryptography. One other thing that he mentioned in this interview that I absolutely resonate with, when he was asked, again, this is someone who works on cryptography and mathematics as a core part of his job, and he's convinced that the most challenging part of his job is managing email. Let someone who has not had that particular pain cast the first stone. It's an interesting interview, and you should absolutely take the chance to read through it if you haven't yet. That sums up what's been released in AWS over the past week. I'm your host, cloud economist Corey Quinn. By day, I fix the horrifying AWS bill at the Duckbill Group. I also snark on Twitter as Quinny Pig, that's QUINNY Pig, and of course, I write the Last Week in AWS newsletter, where you can read versions of what I just said with actual links and a bit more as far as the ecosystem goes. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.